Hello health champions! Today I want to talk about if it's possible to ignite fat burning by eating more fat. And if so, what sort of fats are we talking about? What kind of fats would be the best ones to help start that fat burning and help us accomplish our weight loss goals? Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can keep learning how to get healthy. To most people, it seems like a contradiction in terms when we say eat more fat to burn more fat. Especially if you've been listening to the low-fat dietary advice of the last 50 years, which I might add has not had the most convincing track record. We have more obese people than we've ever had, and we've actually cut back on our fat consumption. There are several hormones in the body that regulate fat burning and fat storing, but there's two in particular that we want to focus on because these two you have direct and immediate control over. And the first one is human growth hormone. And you increase that two ways. One is by fasting, by not eating, and the second is with exercise, especially high intensity exercise. And if you can burn more fat, then obviously on the other side of it you want to store less fat. And that's where insulin comes in. Insulin is a fat storing hormone. It takes excess carbohydrates, turns it into fat, and then promotes the storage of that. And again, fasting is the most powerful way to accomplish both increase in growth hormone and a decrease in insulin. Because when you're fasting, you have just your basic fasting blood sugar level. You're not adding any carbohydrate to the system, so that's the lowest level of insulin that you will have. And the other way is to eat low insulin foods. So carbohydrates trigger the most insulin, protein triggers some, like a moderate to slight amount, but fat triggers a minimal amount of insulin. And I call fat insulin neutral, because it has such a slight influence you can basically disregard it. Now, even though fasting is the most powerful way to improve both of these hormones, growth hormone and insulin, it is simply not sustainable. I mean, you can fast for a period of time, but you can't turn it into a lifestyle and go year after year without eating. That's why we want to understand other tools as well, and that's where keto comes in. Keto is the strictest form of low-carb, high-fat diet, and the good news is you can eat regular meals. Whether you eat 1 or 2 or 3 meals a day, you can maintain yourself in a ketosis state. Now, you get faster results if you eat fewer meals, but you can still stay in ketosis. And in order to get to ketosis, you want to follow certain macros. You want to follow certain guidelines. And the first guideline is to keep your carbohydrates very, very low. So somewhere around 5% of your calories should come from carbohydrates, 5% or less. You eat moderate proteins. You have about 15-20% of your calories from protein. And then fat is just the rest. It's not that you're trying to eat as much fat as possible, as if that's going to accomplish something. It's just that whatever you have left on your budget, so to speak, you just eat fat because it is insulin neutral. So if you have a budget, so to speak, if you eat 2,000 calories a day, that means 25 grams of carbs, 100 grams of protein, and about 165 grams of fat. If you eat a little bit less than like 1,500 calories, then you have 18 grams of carbs, 75 grams of protein, and about 125 grams of fat. If you eat a little bit more, like 3,000, then the numbers go up accordingly. So you could eat as much as 250 grams of fat. But again, it doesn't mean that you're trying to eat more fat. It means you're trying to keep your carbs very low and your protein moderate. But this can still be a little misleading to some people because they get confused by these numbers with the percentages, and they think, oh well, now if I eat 2,000 calories and I've had my 25 grams of carbs and so much protein, now I have to eat 165 grams of fat. And that's just not how it works, all right? We eat so much carb and protein, and then we eat the rest fat until we are full, right? So another way of looking at this would be that instead of a percentage, we just pick a number. And this could be 10 grams, 20 grams, 30, 40, 50 grams. It's different for different people, but for this example, we'll just use 20 grams. Then you eat moderate protein, about 180 to 120 grams. And then for this particular person, they ate until they were full. They added some butter to the vegetables, and they ended up with 100 grams of fat during that day. So they were full at 1,400 calories. Then they're done. And you're still going to be in ketosis because it's not strictly the percentages, it's about how little carbohydrate you ate. So if you have more appetite than this, if you are hungrier than this, and you want to eat a little bit more, then stick to the carbs and the protein and then just have some more fat. So for this person, they ate till they were full. That was 150 grams, and they ended up 1,800 calories. Another person might eat 200 grams of fat and end up at 2,300 calories. So it's not how much fat you eat, it's how little carbohydrate you eat. Now, you could eat too much fat if you eat so much fat that your body has no reason to start digging into the resources on the body. That's the whole point of this, that your body gets so good at using fat that it doesn't care if it comes from the diet or from the body, and that's where you're fat adapted, that's where your appetite goes down, and that's where you don't have to eat so much. So even though you might see a lot of articles and some videos that talk about eat these for igniting this or this function, that's not really how it works, okay? It's not the fat that does anything, it's that it's neutral and you're avoiding the bad stuff. Now, what we have to realize though is that there's still good fats and bad fats. That's why they talk about clean keto and dirty keto. And short term, from a weight loss perspective only, you're going to get the same results. But is that really what we're looking for? So you're going to get the same insulin response from a good fat or a bad fat. Short term, you get the same results. Long term, there's a huge difference. Why? Because there's a difference in the inflammatory response. Good fats are anti-inflammatory, bad fats can be pro-inflammatory. And even if you say that you're just looking for weight loss, then realize that the inflammation can slow weight loss, but most importantly, it can ruin your health. Okay? You're not just looking for weight loss. No matter how much you feel like that's the frustrating point that you want to overcome right now, what you're really looking for is to be healthy and have a quality of life for as long as you can enjoy it. Let's talk about what good fats are. The best fats are essential fatty acids, if we talk from a quality perspective, what the body has to have. Essential means necessary for life. You die without them. And these are building blocks. They are building blocks for membranes, for every cell in your body, but especially for your brain and your nervous system. The health of your membranes depends on the quality of the fats, and that determines the quality of the signals, the ability of your brain and nervous system to send the proper signals to the body parts. Essential fats are necessary for hormones, and they are also inflammatory regulators. Some are pro-inflammatory, some are anti-inflammatory. So these essential fats, they have very, very specific functions. They have very strict and targeted purposes. And whatever fat we eat that doesn't have this strict purpose is going to be fuel. It's going to be our preferred source of energy because it's a steady, stable form of energy that doesn't trigger insulin. So now, what kind of fuel is the best for us? It's the undamaged one, right? If it's damaged, now it becomes pro-inflammatory. It is only good for us, it only burns clean if it's neutral. So undamaged is good, unprocessed is good, because processed fat is damaged. And then we're looking for stable. And stability depends on what type of fat it is. So oftentimes we hear that saturated fat is bad and polyunsaturated fat is good and monounsaturated fat is good. Well, the truth is that the essential fats are polyunsaturated. We need those, but in very small quantities. What we want a lot of is stable, and that's saturated and monounsaturated. And that means it has 0 or 1 double bond. So 0 double bonds means it's saturated. And that means it's a straight molecule. It has very few contact points. There is very little opportunity for it to react with oxygen or light. Therefore, it's stable. It's difficult to damage it. It keeps for months. We can keep it out on the counter for weeks and it doesn't really go bad. And same thing with 1 double bond, that's called monounsaturated, which is your olive oil. You can keep the olive oil on the counter for months. It's stable because it only has 1 double bond. The molecule has 1 little kink in it, and that's still a very low opportunity to interact with the environment. Therefore, it's stable. Those are the good fats for fuel. Now, the worst fats are the ones that are pro-inflammatory. They push your body toward inflammation, which is involved in all degenerative disease like dementia and heart disease and type 2 diabetes and premature aging and so forth. These are the omega-6. They have too much omega-6. Omega-6 is not a bad thing in itself, but when we get 20 times more of a pro-inflammatory than an anti-inflammatory, the body can't maintain balance. And these are polyunsaturated fatty acids, which again is not necessarily a terrible thing by itself, but remember, polyunsaturated means that they have multiple double bonds. That means they're very reactive. They bump into everything. They react with the environment, things like light and oxygen. And therefore they easily get damaged, and when they make oil out of it, they damage it tremendously. Why is that? Have you ever grabbed a husk of corn, and does that feel real greasy to you? Is it easy or really hard to turn that into oil? Well, it's very, very hard. It's only a few % of that corn that is oil. So you have to apply very high heat. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of degrees. They have to apply high pressure. They have to use chemicals and solvents. And after all of that, there is no resemblance to the molecules that was originally in the corn. And then they take some of that and they hydrogenate it. They bombard it with hydrogen atoms and they turn it solid. So they mimic the saturation process, but now they turn it into trans fat, which is basically plastic poison. All right, so let's talk about the best fats. Now, these are polyunsaturated. They're very reactive, so you have to be careful. You have to eat them fresh. And these are the fish fats. And what we're looking for in the body are 2 kinds of fatty acids. They're called EPA and DHA. And the EPA is primarily anti-inflammatory, and the DHA is the building block for the brain. So these two properties are what we're looking for health and for brain function. And we're not going to waste these by using them for fuel. We're going to use them very strategically, so we need very small amounts. Remember, we talked about eating 250 grams of fat in a day. Well, here we're talking about milligrams, 500 to 2,000 milligrams of these for most people. If you have a disease condition, then you might want to increase this for a period of time. But they're very small amounts, less than 1% of all the fat that we eat. Now let's talk about these polyunsaturated acids from plants. And they contain something called ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. And this could be a good thing. It is potentially a good thing because this can become these final end products, the EPA and the DHA that the body is looking for. But the conversion is very, very poor. Most people convert somewhere around 1% of that ALA. And you find ALA, by the way, in nuts and seeds primarily, but especially in flax and chia and hemp. Those are the richest sources of ALA. But we convert it very poorly. And the more you need to convert it, the less you're able to convert it, because if you have inflammation, if you have stress, if you eat a bunch of sugar and grain, then you convert even less than that. So we can't depend on ALA to provide our needs of EPA and DHA. That's why most people would do well to take some fish oil. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that, like we said, the polyunsaturated fatty acids are very, very sensitive. They're super reactive. They get damaged in the blink of an eye by heat and light. So you have to eat these fresh. If you get them straight from the seed, that's the best way. Or if you grind the seed and you eat it or freeze it right away, then you keep it fresh. But if you turn it into oil and you let it sit around, now this turns into poison very, very quickly. It oxidizes, it gets rancid, and now it actually hurts your body. It creates inflammation and toxicity. So the best thing I can say about plant omega-3s is that they are not omega-6s. Okay? Omega-6s promote inflammation. At least these omega-3s, they don't promote it as long as they're fresh. But don't try to eat a ton of seeds and flax and these things just to try to get something that's supposedly good for you. Eat it because it's full of fiber, it's got great protein, and it has lots and lots of minerals and nutrients. So eat it in a good balanced diet, just like you would any other whole food, and just don't overdo it. Don't think of it as a miracle thing, and you'll be all right. Next, we get to monounsaturated fatty acids. So these are the foods that you eat to get fuel. This is what you fill up with. It does have some nutrition, especially if it's fresh and minimally processed. So these are typically your olive oil. That's the primary example of this. But you also get lots of monounsaturated from nuts and seeds, but you want to watch it. So the seeds typically have more omega-3s, and the nuts typically have more of omega-6s. But learn which ones they are so you don't overdo those omega-6s. Olive oil is really the only oil that you want to use for monounsaturates, because once you make oils out of nuts and seeds, they typically taste terrible and they have to process them very, very harshly, like we talked about previously. Another great source is avocado. It's a fantastic food. Best is to eat the whole avocado. I know they make avocado oil, and I do use it for mayonnaise and for cooking occasionally, but realize that in order to make it heat stable, they have to process it. So now it's not that healthy whole food avocado anymore. It's not terrible, it's not high in omega-6s, but it's still pretty harshly processed. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients. So use it once in a while, but don't think of avocado oil as a great source of monounsaturated fat. You use olive oil for that. Now the next one is going to be a shocker for most people, because I don't believe you've ever heard that meat is a great source of monounsaturated fat. The same fat as in olive oil, called oleic acid, is the dominant fat in meat. If the meat has 15% fat, then 6 grams, 6% is oleic acid, which is more than the 5 grams of saturated. So it has mostly fat that is promoted as super heart healthy. Now, the 5 grams of saturated fat, we'll get to a second, is not a bad thing either. When most people talk about saturated fat, they talk about beef fat, animal fat. And this is a great fat if it is grass-fed. Like we just said though, it's not all saturated. 40%, which is most of the fat, is oleic acid or monounsaturated. But the other part of this is that it has a healthy ratio of polyunsaturated. A small percentage of this is actually polyunsaturated. And we want to maintain a ratio between the anti-inflammatory omega-3 and the pro-inflammatory omega-6 of about 1:1. That means it's inflammation neutral. It means it helps the body balance inflammation, and that's a great thing. Another good source of fat is butter. Again, we mostly talk about butter as a saturated fat, but turns out it has 26% monounsaturated or oleic acid, same as in olives. But then it also has some of this saturated fat is very, very liquid. It's very, very easy for the body to process. So 6.5% is short chain fatty acids of 4 or 6 carbons in length. It is processed rather quickly, almost like a carbohydrate, and yet has no insulin response. So it's a much healthier form of energy. 7.8% are medium chain triglycerides. So all in all, more than half the fat, or about half the fat in butter, is not the typical saturated that we think about. Coconut oil is another great example, 65%, but it's shorter chains. That's why it's basically liquid in body temperature, almost liquid in room temperature. And like I said before, what we're looking for in a fat that the body is going to use for fuel is that it's stable. That's the main thing we're looking for, because if it's stable, then it doesn't get damaged, it doesn't get rancid, it doesn't get oxidized, and it doesn't create inflammation. So saturated is inflammation neutral, and that's what's so great about the beef fat, the butter, and the coconut oil. Now let's compare that to grain fed. What happens if that cow was not eating grass, but they were fed in an industrial complex? Now, it's not terrible because it's still going to have that 40% oleic acid, but here's the problem. That ratio that we saw before with grass-fed, that used to be 1:1, now it is 20:1, because they feed the cows all that grain, the corn and the soy, which is super high in omega-6s. So if we feed it to the cow, they're going to incorporate it into the meat, and now the meat is very inflammatory for us to eat. And this is something we want to think about with everything that we eat, that if something had an unhealthy life, then it is not going to bring health to us. And then we get to the really bad stuff. This is the processed plant oils. This is what's been promoted for the last 50 years as the healthy vegetable oils. Well, one example here, like this ad from Mazola, take this ad to your doctor because this fat has no cholesterol in it. With this is a terrible, terrible fat. So canola, soybean, and safflower, none of those are vegetables. Okay? The corn is a grain. canola is a seed, soybean is a legume, and so forth. So we have to rethink this advice on these plant oils. And another one of my favorites is when you read a label and it says it has canola, soybean, safflower, cottonseed, and they won't even tell you exactly what's in there because it's going to change depending on what was cheapest that day. It just doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence for the quality of that product if they can't even tell you what's in it. All of these plant oils are going to be very, very high in omega-6s. They're going to be pro-inflammatory. They're also going to be damaged, like I said, because you can't extract these oils out of grains and legumes without very harsh methods. And on top of that, it's empty calories. Just like you hear sugar being terrible because it's empty calories, well, these oils are the same because they've removed any trace of nutrients that was ever in that food to start with. And at the very bottom of the list, we have the worst of the worst, the trans fats. Now, interestingly, there is a saying in our culture called icing on the cake. And this is a metaphor for something that's the ultimate experience or for something that's the best thing that we could imagine or a surprise benefit of some sort. And yet icing is trans fats mixed with powdered sugar. I don't think you could possibly come up with anything worse. If you want to totally ruin your health, those are like the two absolute worst components, trans fats and sugar. So to have something that represents the epitome of something good, that it's actually the worst of the worst, that just sort of speaks of how backwards we have our whole idea of what food is. And these are things like margarine and shortening. When you take a plant oil, you process it harshly, and then you ruin it with chemicals and high heat and pressure. You have something that's already bad, you make it worse, and then you mix it with sugar. Now, this is what they used to make margarine with, and they still do, but here's the problem. They have caught on. The manufacturers, the marketing people, they know that trans fats are a terrible thing. So what do? They trick you, and they say 0 grams per serving. And what does that mean? It just means it has less than 0.5 grams in one serving. That means 0.49 is going to be rounded to 0. 0.5 would have been rounded to 1, so they just have to keep it under 0.5, and then they shrink the serving down so that they end up with less than half a gram. So if that's a teaspoon, you could still have 10% pure trans fats, pure plastic poison in that product, and they can call it trans fat free, 0 grams per serving. So don't be fooled. And sometimes they would say that it's per tablespoon and it's 0 grams per serving, but it still has 3.5%. So you don't want any amount of trans fats ever again. So what you want to watch for is partially hydrogenated fats. If it has that on the label, it has trans fats in it, no matter what they're claiming anywhere else on the products. Just stay away. So ignition is really the wrong word. Fat does not ignite fat loss, but eating more fat instead of carbohydrates is a great thing. So no, eating more fat isn't better. You do fasting, you eat low carb, you eat moderate protein, and then you eat fat until you're full, right? If you're fat adapted, then you can eat till you're full, and then the body gets the rest from your stored body fat. And like you understand by now, the quality makes a huge difference. You want to eat natural, grass-fed, undamaged fats, because the damaged, the processed, the high omega-6 is pro-inflammatory. It will slow down your weight loss, but more than that, it will make you sick down the road. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you also take a look at that one so you can keep learning about how the body works and how to get truly healthy. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.